Hi everyone, thank you so much for watching. Today we're going to be going over chapter 2, which is about culture and diversity. So let me get that pulled up for us. All right, so let me get to the very top. So chapter 2 is on communication, culture, and diversity. So let me scroll down. Culture is everywhere we experience in everything that we do, everywhere you go. You're going to encounter people that are very diverse. So like in your classroom, not everybody's going to have the same background as you. You're not going to experience things the exact same way. And that's important to understand because sometimes we start to think that everyone should think the way that we think. And that's not necessarily true because they have a completely different upbringing or a way of looking at the world, right? Our worldviews are different because, and we'll talk about this later, very much culture influences that worldview. So as you can see, it says that we encounter diversity every day in our classroom, social media, workplace, medical professional situations, and with our family members. Basically, anywhere that we encounter other people, we are going to encounter diversity because everyone has a different experience. No two people see the world exactly the same way. And so one of the things that we talked about in chapter 1 was how we need to be thinking about how we can be a competent communicator. And one of the ways that we can be a competent communicator is by showing sensitivity when it comes to diversity and differences in culture. So scrolling down to what exactly is culture. So here we have the definition that actually is shown probably, I think, in Oxford Dictionary. And it says the distinctive ideas, customs, social behavior, products, or way of life of a particular nation, society, people, or period. So basically everything that we encounter, right? So ideas, customs, social behavior, products, way of life, and then where and when and with who we encounter it, right? With nation, within a particular nation, a society, a people or a people group or a period of time, right? That kind of covers everything. Ultimately, this is saying we experience culture everywhere we go. All right, so then we have whether it's a complicated and powerful part of human development. The reason why is because when you were growing up, no matter who you are influenced by your culture, right? Many of us grew up in America, so we very much believe in a democratic society, right? We feel very strongly about that we should all have a voice because we grew up here. We may not have that same passion if we live somewhere else, right? It depends on where you're from, what you've experienced, what you've been taught is right or wrong. That very much has to do with your culture. And so this influences the entire communication process. How we communicate is going to be influenced by our culture. I mean, here in America, very much like you're supposed to make eye contact, right? That's something that shows confidence, it shows respect. Whereas in other cultures, that's actually making eye contact with maybe a superior would be considered rude because it would show that you're not showing humility, that you're not trying to be understanding, you're not trying to listen, right? You're not supposed to make eye contact. So think about that. If you went to a different country, and the countries that, like a lot of the Asian societies, this is how it is. If you went somewhere else and you try to make eye contact with someone who is talking to you, maybe superior, they would find that a little offensive. They would think that you were being insubordinate. Whereas here, if someone's talking to you, right, maybe a superior is talking to you, they want you to make eye contact. That would be weird if somebody talked to you and you just did this, right? You wouldn't do that. You wouldn't look away if someone was talking to you. So that just shows you, even just like the nonverbal communication we grew up doing, that is culture based. All right, so then it says we are also members of co-cultures or smaller cultures. That is important because, we have this big idea of national culture, right? That's big. But then it can get smaller and smaller. Like, what about regions? Like, there's a difference in living in the South than living in the North, or South versus Northwest, right? There's so much difference there, even in the way we talk, the way, in the South we say y'all, right? That's cultural. We start saying that because that's what everyone around us says. If you went somewhere else, they would not say that. That's a co-culture, right? It's a smaller area. Then it can get even smaller. Like, we live in Arkansas, and there's a different culture of Arkansas than maybe living in Tennessee, right? And then there's going to be even smaller ones, like you live in Little Rock versus Northwest Arkansas, you go to Pulaski Tech, that is a particular school, it's going to be different than going to UCA. Then that's also going to be a different culture in every single classroom is going to be different. You can see how co-cultures, it just gets smaller and smaller. Another way to think of it is like a time period, right? Like a century. If we think of a whole century from like 1900 to 2000, think about all those decades and how different all those decades are. Each of those decades are like co-cultures within a bigger culture of American history. All right, moving on. So Hofstede's dimension of culture. So Hofstede was a researcher who studied culture and wanted to be able to define basically just how can we break down culture to understand it the best way possible. So he came up with about 6 different dimensions, and he looked at these like a spectrum. So not like your culture is either all the way this way or all the way that way. He looked at it like, okay, you could fall anywhere within that line. So the first thing that Hofstede defined was high versus low power distance. So power distance means exactly what it says, distance from power. So high power distance cultures would be very separated. So people with power would be a small group of people with power, and they'd be very separate from the people who did not have power. This would be more like a dictatorship, right? Or a monarchy. There's a very small group of people who have the power to make influence and decisions. And then there's going to be a big separate gap there. There's also probably going to be big differences in maybe social demographics and what is that word? I'm looking for a word. It'll come to me. So socioeconomic. There we go. Socioeconomic status, different culture groups within that. So there's going to be differences in that. And then you have low power distance. So a low power distance culture believes everybody should have a say. So America would be kind of like a low power distance because we are a democracy. We believe everyone should be able to vote. Everyone should have a say, right? So that would be low power distance. To kind of apply this to an example for everyday use, you might think of this like a high power distance family would be one where the elders and the parents, people who are older, made the decisions, and the younger generations really didn't have a say in that. Whereas a low power distance family would be one that had maybe a family meeting and all people got to have a say. The younger generations and the older generations got to be able to talk about it and make a decision together. Then we have high versus low uncertainty avoidance. So high uncertainty avoidance cultures, basically that is, they want to avoid obviously uncertainty. They don't like change. They don't like not knowing exactly how things would turn out. These cultures would be very much set on tradition. They would very much be thinking about this has worked for us now. Let's keep with this tradition and keep doing the same thing. Whereas low uncertainty avoidance cultures would be okay with for there being a little bit of uncertainty, not knowing exactly what's going to happen. They allow for change, right? They're okay with change. They're okay with just seeing where things go. So maybe another example of this might be, say you're dating somebody, you just started dating, you're going on a couple of dates. Well, one of you is a high uncertainty avoidance person and the other is a low uncertainty avoidance person. So say you're the high uncertainty avoidance person. So you go on a couple of dates and you love it, things are going great, but now you're wondering, okay, well, do they like me? Is this like a serious thing? Are we seeing other people? So then you start asking that person questions like, so where do you see this going? And are we seeing other people or is it just us? And all of a sudden you're really wanting to define that relationship because you don't like those questions just hanging around, right? You don't like there being this uncertainty, not knowing where it's going. Whereas the other person in the relationship or in the dating relationship is fine with that because they are low uncertainty avoidance. So they would like to see just where things naturally went. They're not necessarily trying to pinpoint and answer every single thing. They're okay having a little bit of that just lingering, right? They're not stressed out about that. So that would be high versus low uncertainty avoidance. Now we have individualist versus collectivist cultures. So an individualistic culture is just like it sounds, it's one that's focused on the individual. It's very much about probably competitiveness and individual success. There's also this idea that you should be able to take care of your own and work as hard as you want to. And, you know, like kind of like in America, we think like if you pull your bootstraps up and you work hard, then you can be successful. But it's all about you, right? It's an individual. You work as hard as you want to for your individual success. In a collectivist culture, they're going to be thinking more about the group. It's more about autonomy, about how can we make the group better? How can we make the people around us better? There's probably going to be more things set in place to help individuals versus like helping everyone versus just saying as an individual, you take care of yourself, right? So that would be collectivist. Now we have masculine versus feminine. And so this is talking more so about the way that people communicate, right? So in a masculine culture, both men and women are going to be a little bit more competitive in their communication style, a little bit more assertive. In a feminine culture, they're going to be a little bit more humble, a little bit more thoughtful in the word choices and what they say. They might even be a little bit more likely to kind of beat around the bush with some things in a feminine culture, like if you're in a group working hard. So this is a good example for both. If you're in a group working hard in a feminine culture, say there's one person that's not doing their work in the group. The person who's in charge of that group probably wouldn't say, hey, so-and-so, fix this, you're not doing your part, right? Instead, they would say, hey, let's all remember as a group, let's fix these things, right? So that just kind of like to hint at that person, to tell that person, hey, we're talking about you, right? But we're not going to actually say your name. It should be respectful of everybody, but to get the point across. Now, in a masculine culture, they're more likely to just be very assertive and just say, hey, so-and-so, you're not doing your work, right? They just say it and how it is, right? So that's more of a masculine culture. Then we have long-term versus short-term orientation. Long-term orientation is talking about, or both, is talking about longevity. How far are you thinking? How long are you thinking? Are you thinking like 5-year plan or 100-year plan, right? So a short-term nation is going to be thinking more about the here and now, kind of just figuring things out as we go. Whereas long-term is going to be thinking about way in advance. I mean, if you think about it, there are cultures that have been around for thousands of years. So when they make decisions, they're not thinking about, hey, what are we going to do for the next 10 or 20 years or 100 years? They're thinking, how can we keep our culture going long term? So a good way to think of this now, like in an everyday example, would be like my husband and I. I am probably considered a short-term person. My husband is a long-term person. I thought that I was long-term because I was thinking I have a 5-year plan. Well, long, the term long or short, like those are relative terms. That means that they can mean different things to different people. I thought I was a long-term person until I met my husband, who was saving for retirement since he was 18 years old, right? Like he has been thinking long-term his whole life. He sees things, like he likes to look at a big picture and see how do we achieve that. Whereas I was looking at a smaller picture and just trying to get from this point to this point, right? That's in a short term, and he's thinking long-term. All right, so then indulgent and restrained. So this is a newer one, but indulgent, basically, I like to think of these as indulgent being want and restrained being need. So cultures that are indulgent cultures are okay with people and just doing things that they want to do. They're probably more focused on vacations and getting things they want. Restrained cultures are doing they are more focused on doing what needs to be done. And they actually would probably think that like going on vacation all the time would be kind of rude to all their employees, the people they work with. So they work really hard. Working hard is one of their values in a restrained culture. They do what's needed of them. They don't focus on what they want. And so that's opposite for the indulgent culture. Then we have high versus low context. This was added later by a different researcher named Hall. And Hall decided that high versus low context means that each culture kind of has a varying level of the stress they put on nonverbal communication. So in a high context culture, they put a lot of stress on nonverbal communication, meaning not just the words that they say, but how they say it, their body language. Like everything that they do has a lot of meaning. Low context is more just about the words they say. Like they say the words that they say and they mean what they say. They don't necessarily put a whole lot of, or I wouldn't say a whole lot of, but not as much emphasis on the nonverbal part. All right, then all nations fall along each continuum, not either or category. So remember, like I said before, no culture is just going to be all one way or all the other. Everyone falls somewhere along that continuum in the middle. All right, so race and ethnicity. So now we have to think, we're going back to this idea of diversity and culture. So race is different from ethnicity. A lot of times we get this mixed up, right? Where we think that that's the same thing, but it's not true. Race is actually physical characteristics of a group, like skin color, hair type, eye color, facial structure. Ethnicity is more about common experiences. So more so like, do you share common history? Do we share similar language? Do we eat similar foods? Do we celebrate similar holidays? Do we live in probably in closer proximity to each other, right? So this is the same idea as if somebody said, somebody's from Great Britain, you meet them one day, you're just sitting at a coffee shop and y'all meet, and this person says, I'm from Great Britain, right? Or I'm from England, right? That, and they say, I'm British, or they could just say, I'm British. When they say that, they are talking about their ethnicity. They are identifying with a particular culture or group, right? But I haven't told you what race they are. Just because they're British doesn't mean that they're a particular race, right? They could be any race. They just live and have grown up in Great Britain. So you can see how ethnicity is different from race. Race is a smaller, there's very few races. There's a lot of ethnicities. And you can go as big or small with that as you want. Like you could say I'm British, or you could say, well, actually I'm Scottish, English, Wales, like a smaller set, like part of this British culture, right? And ethnicity is very much self-identified. Like you identify with an ethnicity. And it's safe to say you could even change your ethnicity if you want. That's kind of an odd concept, but you can. I mean, if you lived in America and decided you didn't want to live here anymore, you could move to England and you could live there for several years and be there for a long time. And then that could become what you consider your ethnicity, where you're from, what you do, all of those things, right? So you decide what is your ethnicity. Okay, and so both figure prominently in experience of culture. So the culture that we experience have a lot to do with our race and our ethnicity, but also what we believe, how we see other cultures, how we move forward, how we communicate, all of that, that is actually impacted by the culture that we have experienced through our ethnicity and through our race. All right, so now we have sex, gender, and sexual orientation. So this is kind of the same concept in that there are very few sexes, biological sexes. So biological sexes mean that like something that this is what you're born with, that the doctor says, this is what it is. There's very few of that. But gender is opposite of that in that it is socially constructed. It is something that society has decided, has communicated about, and have decided certain things about, and we have socially constructed that. Right? It's also something that can be self-identified. You can talk about, that's huge in our culture right now. People can self-identify themselves as what they want to self-identify as. And then sexual orientation, that has to do with one's romantic attractions, not necessarily the two things we talked about before, or just talked about. And so the reason that we bring up these things is when we're communicating, when we're speaking either in a group or in a public speaking situation, we want to be sensitive to that. We want to think about it. We don't want to say anything that would upset anyone, right? So just be aware of that and be sensitive when communicating with others. All right, now we have age. And so age is what we call a social demographic. And a demographic basically just means categories. Categories of people, or basically not categories of people, but categories that make us who we are. So like if you've ever had to fill out even like a school application, or if you filled out the census recently, whenever you do that, you get asked a lot of questions, right? They ask you a ton of things about yourself, and it's all little categories, and you have to fill in the dots, right? Those are social demographics. Age is one of those, and one of the reasons why we're talking about that is because age really helps us understand people. Not that everyone in a particular generation is exactly the same, but it helps us understand each other better. So like I said, age influences our experiences. What the time period that you grew up, you experience things very differently, right? So like the two examples given here, the GI generation or the greatest generation, I mean, the people who experienced World War II, that is a totally different generation than like me. I'm a millennial. I've experienced life totally different. The people who experience, like the greatest generation, the people who experienced World War II, they've experienced a lot of things. I mean, many of them probably went through the Great Depression and things that I hopefully will never have to go through, right? So they have a different outlook on life. I was born way later. My parents obviously helped a lot with things. There's just a whole different culture in America at that time. So you can tell, like, both of us just have such, even though we experienced America, right, we're both of the same ethnicity per se, we still have such different viewpoints on things. So by understanding people's age, we can better communicate with them. We can understand them better. But it's not to say we shouldn't assume that every single person is exactly the same. I mean, even just the other day, I gave the example of like music, how different generations listen to different music. I asked people in the class, and one of my students said, I didn't really listen to any music that was cool. I guess for my generation, I listened to older country or older rock music. So again, see, like, just because she grew up in in a particular generation, it didn't mean that she was exactly like her generation. We're all going to be different. We all have different experiences. But it's good to keep that in mind whenever you're communicating, whenever you're thinking about speaking, or whenever you're trying, especially say if you're ever trying to be a manager, you want to think about those kinds of things. How do I communicate? So that goes on too, it kind of leads into this idea of physical and cognitive diversity. Everybody has a different physical and cognitive level, right? So like physically, someone might be extremely fast, right? And then someone may not be able to really run at all like that, but that doesn't make the people like them any one less than another, right? It just means that they're physically different. And so there's a lot of diversity. We want to be sensitive to that. Then there's the idea of cognitive diversity. So we all have different like IQ levels, right? But we also have different ways that we like to take in information, which is what multiple intelligence theory proposes. So it's just saying that there are 7 identities, or 7, there's 7 ways that people like to learn. It's on page 24. And so I don't know if you can see it very well, but if you look at your book on page 24, they have, I'm going to put this up here in case you can see it. They have this circle, and it has all these different things listed. And basically on here, it's just saying that there are 7 intelligences that you might look through. There's things like mathematical logical, which means that you are better at learning things through reasoning and problem solving. Then there's people like that are interpersonal, meaning they learn best through feelings, values, and attitudes, understanding other people. Or there's interpersonal, which means learning through interactions with others, working collaboratively, things like that. So you can see those are 2 totally different people, and so they take in information differently. They like to learn. Not that they can learn in all that we can all learn in all these different ways, but we tend to gravitate towards one more than another. And you can kind of use several, right? It's not that you're only one. You can kind of be a mix of some as well. But it might be a good idea just to look at that and kind of figure out where you fall on that spectrum. But also, whenever you're thinking about communicating with other people, you want to think about, am I giving them this information in the best way possible? For example, I'm more of an interpersonal person, meaning I like to collaborate, and then I'm also an intrapersonal person, meaning I like to, let's see, would I say that right? Yes, intrapersonal person. I am somebody who likes to really talk about feelings, understand and work through things, whereas my husband is more mathematical logical, right? He likes to have facts, he likes to understand it and just be very bam, 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 bam. So whenever we get in an argument, or say I'm upset about something, I sometimes come in and I just want to explain everything, and I want to share all my emotions, and I just lay it all out there, and it's a lot for him to take in. He's kind of like, I don't know where you're going, right? Like where is all this information? Like, just condense it for me. Now, if I were to come into him and just sit down, not emotionally, and say, hey, I just want to talk to you about something. The other day you did this, and it upset me for this reason, and I would just hope that maybe in the future you could do it this way. If I said it exactly like that, my husband would be like, got it. All right, sorry I hurt your feelings. I understand what you're saying. Moving on. Right? Because I presented it to him very factually and logically, like, you did this, it hurt my feelings because of this. Here's what would make me feel better. That is easy for him to understand. So when we think about communicating with other people, we have to think, what is the best way to talk to them? And as you get to know people, you'll be able to see it. Especially take some time and look at that and think about people that at that little at the multiple intelligence theory, the little pinwheel, I keep calling it that, but like the little spectrum that it gives us. Think about people in your life that you're close to, you'll be able to start identifying who they are, which ones they connect best with, right? And then maybe as you move forward, try to communicate with them in a way that best suits that, right? And I promise you, your communication will become better if done so. This is also a great thing to do if you're ever wanting to be a manager, or if you are a manager, think about, who am I talking to? Not everybody takes the same message the exact same way. I need to construct it for the individual. And if I do that, I can be a very successful leader. All right, oh my goodness, ideological diversity. So this has to do with ideologies, and ideologies are ideas, beliefs, ideals, and all these things that form our worldview. So our perspective on the world, the way that we view the world. We'll talk about perspective next chapter, but basically our worldview is very much constructed from our ideals, and it's also, it provides a basis for action, whatever motivates you, right? Like if you've ever experienced, I am very into adoption because I was adopted. So obviously, like, I am very passionate about that. Some people might not be as passionate about that because they have not experienced foster care or adoption. If you have, you probably have a little bit more passion for it than other people. That's because I have gone through things that have caused me to have this particular worldview. This is also what impacts our political beliefs, right? That's pretty obvious. And then family and society are significant in developing these ideologies. And that's because if you think about that, wherever you grew up, whichever culture you grew up in, your family, your society, of course, that culture is going to have a lot of impact on you, because as you grew up and to understand the world, that is what was fed into your brain. That's how you came to learn. So if you were somewhere like an individualistic culture that is very much about, individual success, you're great with that. Like, you're very passionate about it. You want to do that. You strive with that. Sometimes some people strive with that. Now, other cultures, if you grew up in a collectivist culture, you would think that some of the things that individualistic cultures do might be rude, right? So you have to think about that. A lot of our ideologies has to do with where we grew up in our family and what we were taught when we were younger. All right, so religious diversity. Again, this is kind of just saying many religions, there's lots of religions, and this has a very strong impact on our experience. So we want to be aware of that. We want to be aware of that when we're communicating with other people. We want to be sensitive to it. We don't want to push our thoughts on other people unless they ask and they're open to it. That's great. But otherwise, it's typically not the best idea to try to force someone to believe what you believe. It's kind of like we talked about last chapter, like just trying to force someone into agreement with you through communicating more and more and more isn't always the best tactic, right? And so there's a new developing trend in spirituality, and so that's going to be a little bit different than religion per se. Spirituality can be a lot of different things, so lots of different people, but it's more about just kind of like that there's a bigger entity, but I'm not really sure what that is. And the whole spiritual aspect of, like, I feel like my spirit and all those things, but it's not necessarily tied to a religion. But we just basically, this whole purpose of this is you just want to be sensitive to others, what their beliefs are, and understand that just because you believe one way doesn't mean that someone else is, and we shouldn't have to force them to do so. All right, so lastly, communicating in a diverse world. So what can we take away from this chapter? Ultimately, what I hope that you will do is I hope that you will make your message accessible, understanding that since there is such a diverse group always going to be your audience, right? No two people are going to be alike. There's going to be lots of people who've had different experiences. They have different physical, mental, all of that abilities, and you need to be able to communicate with all of them. So therefore, you want to make it accessible to everyone. Your message, you want to be sensitive to everyone in your message. Accessible just means think about who you're talking to. Try to think about, if I'm talking to children, I need to communicate at a childlike level. If I am talking to adults, this is how I need to communicate. If I am talking to, you name it, but basically think about the audience and try to communicate the best way for that audience. And then don't highlight differences in others. So if you want to be a good communicator, one of the best things you can do is find ways that you connect. In our speech, the first speech that we write, well, in all the speeches we write, but in the first one, one of the things I ask you to do is to relate to your audience. Try to make your message relatable. And that's the way, when we do that, when we remind people that we're more alike than we're different, people are more likely to listen. If someone feels very much like you're nothing like me and you don't understand my experience, they're not likely to listen to you. So think about how can I relate to my audience that I'm speaking to? How can I relate to this person I'm speaking one-on-one with? It's not that you can't celebrate differences. It's just that most of the time we can find more things in common than we realize, and we want to focus on that. And then we have finally avoid is language. Like, don't say anything that would be sexist, racist, you name it. Basically, think about how the words and the things that you're saying, how would that make someone else feel? You want to be sensitive to that, and you want to be caring enough not to say something that would be like stereotyping someone or that would hurt somebody's feelings, right? So ultimately, what we can take away is that diversity is all around us. No two people experience the world the same exact way. We all are influenced by culture. And so when we communicate, we want to be sensitive to others, and we want to understand that not just because we experience life a certain way doesn't mean that everybody's going to experience it the same way.